move on here, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on the history of boating in New England. I promise not to take forever to do this, but I just wanted to give a brief overview. The earliest boats to navigate the waters of New England, of course, were navigated by Native Americans, the tribal people, the indigenous tribal people that lived here. They were made by them from towering trunks of tulip poplar or chestnut or oak, and they would, carve them out with stone tools and fire and burn them out to create these very long, sturdy vessels that they used to, travel all along the coast from the Gulf of Maine to Massachusetts Bay to Long Island Sound, as well as along river routes inland in search of beaver and fish. The beaver, of course, the beaver pelt and the fish, they would trade with settlers as well as each other. Another type of boat, another type of canoe, the canoe you might be more familiar with, is the sort of elliptical shaped one. Those were made with tamarack, ribs of tamarack, and bark that would be sewn onto them. So this is a more familiar example. At the bottom right here is a canoe that was adopted, by locals up in northern New England, upstate New York. They were emulated. These canoes were emulated by craftsmen. This is a copy or a replica, if you will, of something called the Rushton canoe. The Rushton canoes were very, very popular, particularly up and around the Adirondack regions. And Rushton was a boat builder. I think he started out as a clerk in a shoe store or something like. I believe that was his first job. But he learned how to make boats. And the example that you see here was built by a fellow named Jeffrey Burke, who works out of New Hampshire, up near Lake Winnipesaukee. And but the Native American tribal people, of course, went and traveled around the region in boats like these, out on Fisher's Island Sound. Pequots routinely paddled out to Montaukett, as they called fishers, to hunt and fish and gather clams, and just like its current seasonal residents, escape the summer swelter and the heat and enjoy the cool breezes out there. Narragansett similarly navigated the coastal waters of ponds like Ninigret in what is now Rhode Island, to harvest shellfish and whatnot. And the illustration that you see on the left side of the page, these are actually tribal people from Virginia, but the methods were similar. Although I'm sure that the board of directors of LaGrua would be happy to have me stipulate that you should never build an open fire in the middle of your boat. Italian explorer Giovanni de Verrazzano was the first known European to sail these waters in 1524, though legends of much earlier Viking visits persist. In his ship's log, Verrazzano mentioned that he saw an island full of hills and covered with trees, which ultimately became known as Block Island, after Dutch explorer Adrian Block, who passed by in 1614 aboard the Onrust. And you can see a replica of the Onrust on the upper right-hand side of your screen there. According to contemporary records, the Onrust, which meant unrest or restless in Dutch, was a small yacht of about 8 lasts, or 16 tons, measuring 44.5 feet, with a beam of 11.5 feet and a 38-foot keel. Block had her built in New York Bay after his original galleon, the Tiger, caught fire and burned near the southern end of Manhattan. So using timber salvaged from the Tiger, the Onrust was the first wooden ship built by Europeans in the New World. In the wake of the explorers came the merchants, who sailed along the coast and up the Connecticut River in triple-masted clipper ships. And fishermen, too, worked these waters, straining their backs, hauling nets over the gunwales of crafts that came to be indelibly linked with New England boats and New England maritime history. Boats such as the catboat, which you can see depicted here, famously depicted here by Winslow Homer. Today, we can recognize their spiritual, if not direct descendants, in shipboats like Tigris on the left, or lobstering sloops like Winsome on the right, both of which are featured in my book. Other hardy working vessels, such as Annie, dredged Long Island Sound's muddy depths for oysters, while carriers like Grayling, Grayling's on the left, Annie is on the right, filled their holds with decks with hundreds of pounds of sardines and oysters. These boats have been yachtified now for pleasure, but in their day, of course, they were serious, sturdy working vessels. The black and white photo you see to the top right-hand side of your screen, that's Annie. That's Annie. I don't know whether my cursor shows up here. This is Annie here, and this is Annie in her day, just loaded with oysters, and they would load her up on one end of the sound, and then she'd haul them down to another end, and then load them up with cabbages or whatever it is that people wanted to ship. Sometimes garbage. She was basically a floating dump truck. Now these boats were worked by men, like the crew of Neptune that you can see here, which is the oldest boat in the Stonington fishing fleet. Men who routinely risked their lives to put food on other people's table. These photos, by the way, are taken by a neighbor of LeBrew, a fellow named Ray Uzanis, who's a terrific guy and a brilliant photographer. And he was kind enough to share his photos with me for my book. There's a chapter on Neptune in my book. In addition to working, these small craft were also used for racing as long ago as colonial times, especially in and around Newport, Rhode Island. So the Herreshoffs, Newport, and big yachts like 1934's Rainbow would ultimately become forever linked with the America's yachting tradition and the famed America's Cup during the mid-19th century. And replicas like Hanuman, which you see here, and also featured in my book, helped to keep the class alive. As the nation's competitive spirit grew, so did its number of yacht clubs. The desire to challenge fellow members inspired fleets of identical racers like the H-12s, the Fish class, and the International One designs. Eventually, sailboats had to share New England's watery highways with sleek and elegant and fast cabin cruisers like Aphrodite and Miss Asia, the playthings of jazz-age millionaires. Both these vessels, those of you who live locally probably know. You can find them both down in Watch Hill. Other respectably powerful cruisers of the day included the Annie Laurie in the upper left, and the former rum runner, Katie Mack. Katie Mack was built for speed and stealth for obvious reasons. And when she was built, she was devoid of any kind of comfort. It was just an empty hull, basically, so they could load it up with Canadian whiskey. But since then, she's been modified with a galley and bunks and cabins and whatnot. As maritime technology advanced, often in response to war efforts, new materials such as fiberglass offered boat owners a durable alternative to the laborsome and time-consuming maintenance of wood. Arion, which you see on the left here, stands out as the first fiberglass yacht of her size and kind, built in those prolific World War II years. Meanwhile, Muskrat, dating to the same era and modeled on traditional New England coastal fishing boats, was one of the first fiberglass keels to cut through the waters of the Pawcatuck River. Lobstering vessels of down East Maine also inspired leisure crafts like Kittiwake II, while ancient boat building traditions from boatyards half a world away influenced the detailed craftsmanship of the Turkish-built Carina. Carina's below here. She was built far away in Turkey. Then there are these one-off vessels, which are kind of fun. And their inspiration rests solely with the sort of mad genius of a single person. This is Mrs. M. She began her life as a transport ship, a personnel carrier off the USS Saratoga, an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean during the Vietnam War. And she was bought at auction by a fellow from Noank who turned her into an oystering boat. He put a superstructure on top of her. It used to just be open. And he put a superstructure on top of her and and then kind of cannibalize some winches and whatnot, and you know, to be able to haul oysters out of the Sound. This works out of Noack. Ulysses is another unique vessel, a one-off cruiser with lines very, very much like a sailboat, designed in the 60s by a naval architect from Long Island. And he claimed that he could sail her around the world on $800 worth of fuel. Others have been customized to reflect those owners' cultural heritage, like the Mende Liberté, which was built by an African-American music professor from Glastonbury, Connecticut. And she was fortunate enough to get pieces of Iroko wood that were used to, you know, that were left over from the construction of the slave ship replica Amistad. She was at the seaport, and the director of the shipyard there shared those with her, and she incorporated those into this vessel, which she built. It's the second boat she ever built in her life. She grew up inland in down south, and but she incorporated not only the wood, but West African designs and motifs in the decor of the boat. The type of boat it is, it's an Alaskan Tolman skiff, and she operates it though now out of Glastonbury. So all of these, everything that I wanted to share had to have some kind of story to them. Every single boat in the book had to have some kind of story. Now, we all know that sailors love to tell stories. And the fact, in the course of doing my research for the book, I rarely did I ever come upon somebody who said to me, well, I have absolutely nothing to say to you about my boat. You know, just the opposite. The problem is, how long do you want to listen to something like that without going crazy? So I didn't want to fill the book with you know, details about foresheets and lanyards and forecastles and other words that, you know, are spelled nothing like they sound. And I wanted to tell deeper stories, as I said in the beginning of my talk here, stories about the people who built them, and where and why and where they sailed, and what kind of stories they had behind them. So that's what I'd like to do with the rest of my time here, is just tell you a couple of stories that are featured in the book. The first one is about Clang 2. Clang 2 is a 1924 gaff-rigged English Channel yawl. She was built nearly a century ago in the Falmouth, England shipyard of W.E. Thomas. W.E. Thomas primarily built working boats, fishing boats, and working craft. But in 1924, a local yachtsman by the name of Cecil Taylor Hamilton came to the yard and said, "I'd like you to build me a boat called a Falmouth Key Punt." These were sturdy working vessels that varied in length from about 20 to 30 feet and cruised the English Channel in the days before radio. And what they would do is they would leave the port when merchant vessels were coming in. You know, when they spied a merchant vessel coming in way off the coast, these punts would go out and greet them. And what they would do is they would find out from the ship captains what was the manifest, what did they have aboard, what did they have to sell, and then they would sail back into port and convey that information to the merchants, so that by the time the merchant vessel pulled into port, everything on board had already been sold and it was all done, and all they had to do was just unload it to the merchant, to the highest bidder. So that's what they were designed for. In port, while they were in port, they also served as launches for the merchant vessels, and, you know, for ferrying crew and passengers aboard and replenishing supplies. The distinctive features of these boats is that they had deep drafts and short mainmasts, and these beamy, what they were called jump decks. They were very beamy, broad decks, so that sailors from the higher merchant ships could jump down onto them with ease. Well, because of their world-renowned seaworthiness, from about 1860 onwards, key punts began influencing yacht designers the world over, at a time when leisure yachting was becoming increasingly popular. So Hamilton, the first owner of Clang 2, was likely following this trend when he asked, you know, them to build Clang 2 for him at the shipyard. And so at 40, she was bigger than most key punts. She was 48 feet. on deck. So that's about twice the size of a traditional key punt. And he named her Clang 2, probably after the Malay word clang, which means river. And he was a British officer and served in the I believe in like Burma or somewhere in that part of the world. And so he was probably familiar. That's where he probably picked up the word. Well, as a member of the Royal Cornwall Yacht Club, Hamilton skippered Clang 2 in various regattas through the 1920s and 30s before he sold her to a Lieutenant Colonel W.B. Edwards of Falmouth, who in turn sold her to John Philip Robinson of Derbyshire. And Robinson painted her longleaf yellow pine hull white and routinely sailed her across the channel to France from her new port in Suffolk. By the outset of World War II, she was owned by a Channel Islander by the name of Philip Le Marquand, and it was during these years that Clang 2 entered the history books as one of the 19 Jersey Island boats called upon in June of 1940 to rescue some 20,000 British and Canadian troops from Saint-Malo, one of several towns on the western coast of France under imminent threat from Nazi invasion. You may be more familiar with the Dunkirk story, and that took place a little bit before. But here is Saint-Malo down here, and here's Jersey. So this is where she was based, and this is Saint-Malo where these troops were holed up. Well, after the last rescue boat was safely out of the harbor, the British dynamited Saint-Malo's oil depot and airport to keep them out of Nazi hands. And according to one contemporary news report, when Clang 2 left Saint-Malo, the harbor was a mass of flames and thick black smoke that could still be seen 12 hours later from Jersey, some 40 miles west. As for Le Marquand's own entry in the ship's log, it was so much less dramatic. He wrote, "Arrived Saint-Helier, Jersey at 2:30 a.m., discharged passengers and made some soup, cleaned up the ship and went home." Sort of understated the whole experience. Though smaller and less famous than Dunkirk's Operation Dynamo 2 weeks earlier, that evacuated 340,000 British troops, the Saint-Malo mission had the distinction of being carried off without the loss of a single life or damage to a single ship, according to the official government record. In honor of this aid, the Saint-Helier Yacht Club was awarded what is known as a defaced red ensign. This is a nautical flag featuring a Union Jack and a personalized coat of arms. They remain the world's only yacht club so honored for service in wartime. In 1966, Clang 2 was bought by an Australian boating journalist, the late Murray Davis, who was founder of Cruising World and Sail magazines. And he sailed her across the Atlantic to cover the 1967 America's Cup race. Making landfall in the Caribbean before heading to Newport, Davis and his family lived aboard the boat, which he outfitted with a wheelhouse while painting her white topsides to black. So this is the photo here on the left of Clang, now painted black. In 1967, a fellow Aussie and former editor of Soundings, Keith Taylor, purchased Clang 2 and brought her to Essex, Connecticut, where she changed hands once again. Her new owner poked around the waters of the lower Connecticut River and made many valiant attempts really over a long period of time to restore her. But sadly, as his restoration budget sank, so did Clang 2, to the bottom of the Connecticut River while in dock in Essex. And that was the shape that she was in back in 2000 when this fellow, Richard Rip Heyman of Lower Manhattan, got together with a group of like-minded maniacs who bought the sunken, sodden vessel. I mean, he bought her, I shouldn't say sight unseen, he bought her, but the only thing you could see was the mast, which was sticking up out of the water. The very top of the mast, I should say. Well, they brought her to Pier 25 in New York, where they formed the Clang 2 Association, dedicated to the daunting task of making Clang 2 seaworthy again. Several years and many dollars and man-hours later, Clang 2's original oak ribs and pine planking were watertight once more, thanks to some tar and lead sheathing in her hull. Under full sail, with her main, mizzen, fore, flying top, and assorted jibs from her 8 sailbags all flying. She moves like a knife through water, Heyman told me, with a top speed of about 9 knots. In 2001, Klang Tu crossed paths with fate again. Heyman took her up the Hudson to be hauled for repairs on September 10th, just one day before the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. At the height of the chaos, police boats cut the moorings at Pier 25 to reach people in Lower Manhattan, a rescue operation that also involved commandeering civilian vessels. So it was really kind of like another Dunkirk. It was like a little Dunkirk. Heyman recalled that it was just chaotic. It was a bumping mania. And he feared that if he had left Klang Tu there, she probably would have been just crushed and maybe even sank. Well, since then, Klang Tu has kind of been a ship without a home, unfortunately. She's been tying up at various ports in and around New England, Vineyard Haven, Provincetown, Gloucester, Nyack, and she was at Schooner Wharf in Mystic when I saw her. Most recently, from what I understand, she is in West Mystic. I can't recall if she's tied up or in dry dock. And there was some interest expressed by the Jersey Heritage and Jersey Maritime Museum in the UK. They expressed an interest in bringing her back to England, but as always, money is an obstacle, and the funds required to get her in shape for the crossing and then her upkeep really haven't been forthcoming. So, if anybody out there, after you've already dug deeply in your pockets to contribute to La Grua, want to buy a boat, you contact Rip Heyman of the Klang Tu Association. Our next story concerns the Cangarda, a steel-hulled 138-foot Victorian-era luxury steam yacht, really one of the last of her kind in the world. She certainly looks like a dreamboat, but she's had her share of nightmares and misfortune. In fact, I entitled my chapter on her, The Curse of the Cangarda. The curse began not long after her first owner, lumber baron Charles J. Canfield of Manistee, Michigan, took possession of the vessel. She was built at the Pusey and Jones shipyard of Wilmington, Delaware, where she was launched in May of 1901. The name Cangarda, by the way, is an acronym for Canfield and his wife's maiden name Gardner, so Can and Gard, Cangarda. Her deck houses were crafted from rich Cuban mahogany, featuring a dining salon for 20 and a smoking salon aft. Below decks, there were sleeping quarters for 14, with included 4 staterooms plus cruise quarters. They were all illuminated by skylights, and of course there was a galley down there to provide the luxurious dinners for the guests in this dining salon. In the engine room, there were no less than 7 coal-fired steam engines to drive her propeller and other systems like bilge pump and air pump and windlass and so on. So she was really the quintessential product of an era before income taxes, when the personal wealth of industry magnates like Canfield soared to giddy heights. Now, Canfield, he was somewhat rich and idle. Canfield was praised as a man of probity in a 1900 survey of prominent Michiganders. He unfortunately didn't display much probity when it came to his marriage, however. On his first and very last cruise aboard Cangarda, he was caught in a indiscretion, as the paper put it, with a young female passenger. His wife sued for divorce and sold Cangarda for a reported $10,000 in 1903. And she sold it to this fellow here, George Taylor Fulford, who was a prominent Canadian businessman and politician from Brockville, Ontario. Fulford made his fortune hawking pink pills for pale people, a nutritional supplement which was composed of starch, sugar, and iron sulfate, which is essentially salt. So he paid $100 for the patent in 1890 from the product's inventor, a fellow named Dr. Williams. The product promised to cure just about any illness that could come to the hypochondriac's mind, and was apparently in the vanguard of the women's liberation movement, helping women summon the energy to compete in a man's world. I say that facetiously, of course. 9 years and God knows how many pink pills later, Fulford, by then a senator and a multimillionaire, built himself a 20,000 square foot summer mansion called Fulford Place, overlooking the St. Lawrence River, which became Cangarda's new home. Fulford renamed Cangarda Magadoma, which was a composite of the names of his wife and children, and the boat became a focal point for the Fulford summer social life. But then in October of 1905, the curse struck again. While being driven across a trolley track in Newton, Massachusetts in a chauffeured car, Fulford was struck by an oncoming train. He died a week later, the victim of what went down in history as Boston's first fatal auto accident. The first of many, I think. Magadoma nonetheless remained a fixture at Fulford Place for decades, hosting numerous high-profile guests, including prime ministers and British royalty. Among the most famous in 1927 was Edward, Prince of Wales, who abdicated the throne 9 years later to marry American divorcee Wallis Simpson. Flying royal colors for the occasion, Magadoma cruised the river separating the United States and Canada, while summer residents on either side cheered. So it was a real international welcome. When the war came in 1941, the family loaned Magadoma to the Royal Canadian Navy for navigational training. The Navy expressed its gratitude and fulfilled the curse by returning her with $13,000 worth of damage. By 1951, Magadoma ended up in the hands of D. Cameron Peck of Chicago. He was an early collector of classic cars and steam yachts. He commenced repairs on the ship, including converting her coal engines to oil. But then in 1954, the curse struck again, almost. Peck became convinced he was dying of cancer, sold everything he owned, and moved out to Arizona for his health. The move must have done him good. He actually survived there another 30 years. The following few decades were kind of twilight years for Magadoma, who was rechristened Cangarda by her next owner, Frederick Burtis Smith of Rochester, New York. He was the son of a wealthy attorney from Minneapolis, and he worked as an architect in New York during the Roaring '20s. So he did a lot of business with Rockefellers and whatnot, and that crowd. He was a lifelong bachelor and literally lived on boats most of his life, including a 28-year stint aboard Cangarda, which he kept tied to a Genesee River dock, which you see right here, tied up at the bottom of the screen there. And that's pretty much where she stayed throughout his entire ownership. He was an interesting fellow. He was kind of trapped in the Edwardian era, if you will. He wore a coat and tie every single day, and he loved to host these kind of lavish dinner parties on board to sort of recapture some of that gaiety that he knew, the pre-Depression gaiety that he knew. He kept her intact, but after 30 years of inactivity, after 30 years of just sitting, she was in need of a significant facelift. By the time she passed into the hands of her next owner, a fellow named Richard Reedy of Gloucester, Massachusetts. This was in 1983. Reedy was dedicated to Cangarda's full restoration and set about doing the thing right. He sent the engines to London's Kew Bridge Steam Museum to be rebuilt. He also removed the mahogany paneling piece by piece, as well as her skylights and portholes and hardware and whatnot. And he had the presence of mind to carefully store them all, awaiting restoration. Unfortunately, 10 years and $850,000 later, the curse struck again. Reedy fell ill, and he ran out of money. Well, Cangarda's naked, rotting hull came to a listing rest in the muddy tidal waters of Boston Harbor, where another potential curse victim, Elizabeth Meyer, found her in 2000. As president of Newport's J-Class Management, who are project overseers of historic yachts, Meyer recognized Cangarda's potential. She hauled her and set about searching for the right person to breathe life back into Cangarda's weary soul. That's when self-described sucker and California businessman Robert McNeil stepped in. With a rusting hull too far gone, McNeil had it laser scanned and precisely recreated. And so these are images from this extensive restoration. it took 5 years, many millions of dollars, as you can imagine. And the job was done in a boatyard in Richmond, California, the Rutherford Boat Shop. After the restoration was completed in 2009, the Curse fired one last shot across the elegant scrollwork of Cangarda's bow during her launch ceremony. Well, I have a video here I want to show you, and I have to warn you, if you get weak knees, you might not want to watch this, okay?
Oh my God. Get her in the water quick.
Well, what had happened there was a vertical stay gave way, causing her to list. Unfortunately, a quick-thinking helmsman gunned the engine and the ship righted herself. Still, it was pretty, as you can imagine, it was a pretty harrowing moment for McNeil. The only damage, because of the mishap, was the breaking off of one fiberglass stabilizer fin, which really showed the stability of the vessel, McNeil told me. Well, McNeil remains philosophical about the perils and pitfalls of classic boat ownership. As the owner of the 131-foot Coronet, one of the world's largest surviving 19th century schooner yachts, and Joyant, a classic 1911 Herreshoff racer, McNeil sheepishly confesses, "These boats just seem to find me." He has generously shared the wealth, as it were, by loaning Cangarda for a season here and there to the Mystic Seaport for the public to enjoy, which is where I was able to see her myself. And that New England connection is actually how and why she ended up in my book. So those are just a couple of the kinds of stories that you'll find in this book, which I hope you'll dive into yourself. I know it's available at Bank Square Books in Mystic and its sister store, Savoy and Westerly. And I believe that LaGrua has kindly put up some link for you to be able to order the book if you haven't ordered it already. I encourage you to support these businesses, these local businesses, especially in these times. And my thanks again to LaGrua for inviting me to give this virtual talk. If I can answer any questions, I'd be happy to try, with the proviso that I'm a storyteller and not a diehard deep water sailor, though the two may not be mutually exclusive. So I'd like to turn this back over to LaGrua.
Can you hear me, Tom?
I can hear you, Kelly, yes.
Okay, great. I have turned on my video, but I'm not seeing myself. I don't know if other people can see me, but...
I can see you.
Oh, good, okay. All right, we've got one question so far, and I would like to, before we get to that, to remind everyone that the link to buy the book is in the Q&A section. You just have to find it under Answered, and there will be a link there where you can click on and buy the book. Okay, so... we have someone who said this was beautifully presented, Tom. Thank you. And someone who says that they can see me. Thank you for letting me know. Do we have any other questions for Tom? I'll give it a second to see if anybody is typing.
I'm jumping on too, because come on, people, no questions.
Here we go. We have one that is favorite no-ank story / boat.
Is that a question?
It is. What's your favorite no-ank story slash boat?
What's my favorite no-ank story slash
Yes.
boat?
Yes.
Well, I have a couple of no-ank boats in there, and I wouldn't want to name a favorite only because I wouldn't want to hurt any feelings of the people that own the boats there. But I will say that no-ank is just an incredible resource for boats and people who know their way around boats. I spoke to many people there, getting a lot of local history. And I mean, the image here that I presume you still see on your screen is of Winsome, a no-ank lobstering boat. This is the kind of boat they went out and caught lobsters in many moons ago. And there's a wonderful story of how that boat came to be built in my book. So no-ank itself is just a terrific place for boats and is famed throughout the boating world.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions for Tom?
I'm going to jump in and just ask, Tom, do you boat yourself? Did you learn how to sail or have a power boat? What's boating in your life?
That's a good question. Actually, I mean, I grew up in Rhode Island, so I grew up, the water, even though I was born in Providence, I mean, I spent a lot of time down in South County, Rhode Island, on the water, near the water, in the water. And, as a teenager and whatnot, I probably spent more time out on Boston whalers than I did luxury sailboats. But I actually didn't learn to sail until I got married, and I moved to Boston, and I learned how to sail on the Charles River, which is not an easy place to sail, I have to tell you that, because of the big buildings and the wind that just shifts constantly there. But there's a wonderful little community yacht club there, and that's where I learned to sail. I was 30 years old, I think. And on my first solo sail, I did everything that one is supposed to do on one's first solo sail. I ran aground. I almost capsized. And owing to the geographic nature of the place, I collided with the Longfellow Bridge, which always amused me because I think to myself, I always thought of the people who were driving across the bridge at that moment to see this mast there with this sail just luffing up against the bridge. But anyway, when my wife and I moved to this area, we did buy a catboat, which we owned for several years and enjoyed sailing around here. And my wife learned how to sail from her father, who was a Yale Marine, who was a hardcore sailor. And she inherited some of his bark, but none of his bite. But so going out and sailing with her, she had a much better time if she just let go and lay down, because she was always correcting me. But I needed a lot of correction. What can I say? But I mean, I'd still get out on the water now and then in the best kind of boat to have, which is other people's boats. So.
But we have a couple more questions, Tom.
Sure.
One is, what was your most surprising discovery or boat myth busted during your research?
Surprising discovery or what?
Or a boat myth that was busted?
Boy, that's a good question. I would say that, I mean, it may not be so surprising, but it just underscored for me the kind of flavor of the era, if you will. With boats like Miss Asia and Aphrodite, those boats were owned by, what were called the sort of Gold Coast millionaires up in Long Island, who would get on them in the morning, come across their lawns in their pajamas and bathrobe and hop on board and shave and dress on board and then arrive at Wall Street, ready to work for the day. I thought that was just so indicative, of the era. I think, but what I enjoyed was the way that boats went from sort of one person to the next. That's what they do. That's what a lot of these classic boats do. I mean, McNeil, who owns Cangarda, did tell me that, and I think many classic boat owners would agree, that you don't really own these things. You just sort of caretake them and pass them on. So you just have them for a little while. And you know, it's hard to pick out like any one particular story that, you know, I think, you know, if I do say so myself, they're all really interesting stories. I mean, there's another one about a woman who owned a boat called the, it was a skiff up on Winnipesaukee, and she kept the boat for years and years and years, and it just sort of rotted. It was not quite rotting, but it was in tough shape. And she gave it to a restorer. She just gave it to him, and she had one last row in this boat before she died. And she used to row it when she was a girl to go visit other people on the lake. And she took to it like she was 12 years old again. And she was probably in her late 80s or early 90s, maybe. So they're just these stories like that. That's what I really was looking for in this book. You know, there are plenty of books out there that talk about all the technical aspects of these boats. And there's an awful lot of stuff on the hair shops, of course. But I was just looking for little stories like that. And so I don't know if I've answered the question, but.
Well, how long did it take you to compile this research? Someone else is asking.
Well, you know, the genesis of the book, as I said, was a weekly column for the Sun, and I did it throughout the summer. So, you know, I had a week on each chapter pretty much to go out and get the information, do the interview, see the boat. But after that, when I decided to put it together into a book, I was able to take a little bit more time, and I added additional chapters. The publisher, Globe Pequot, God bless them, they're still doing a business with a lot of challenges with COVID-19 and whatnot. But they, of course, wanted me to expand it. The original book was, the original column only concerned boats from the Westerly Sun's readership, which was from Charlestown to the Mystic River. And I expanded it to include boats up in Massachusetts and Maine, New Hampshire. And so those took me a little longer. I was able to take my time. And so all in all, I think that the thing took me probably 6 months or so to add the chapters and, you know, research them and write them and travel around to various places. And it took a while for it to get published, though. It was being talked up with another publisher for a while, and that kind of fell through. It took me 5 years to get this book finally in print. And that's not unusual sometimes for books. Sometimes books take years and years and years bouncing around before they hit the desk of just the right editor. And they did at Globe Pequot.
Okay, well, I think that's all of our questions.
And I'll take it from here and just thank you, Tom, so much for this really fascinating talk. This is the nice thing for Kelly and I, when we're running an event in the space, we don't get to hear often the whole talk because we're dealing with latecomers or air conditioning or noise or something, and I could actually sit and listen. And we know how much harder it is, especially when you say something funny and you don't get a reaction from the audience, because I was really cracking up about the women and the pink pills.
Well, I mean, I'll help you. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard when you can't hear somebody if you don't know whether you're
if you're on, if they're hearing you.
So I'm glad
someone has suggested we're now, Kelly and I, people in our business are movie producers, and you folks are actors having to act for a camera without that kind of live response. So we're deeply appreciative to you. I urge the audience to buy the book. Books make great gifts. And I want to, of course, thank the audience for coming to us tonight. I know some of you do own boats, and you could have been out on the water, and you may be about to go out on the water, because tonight would probably be a beautiful evening to be out there. So thank you for supporting La Grua Center and for Tom and Bank Square Books. And we hope to have you back again with us soon. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.